Picture a sky that doesn't clear for weeks. Not a passing storm, but a season, sometimes months long, where the rain simply doesn't stop. No forecast, no radar, no warning at all beyond the smell of the air changing and the animals starting to move. For most of human history, this wasn't a disaster movie premise. It was a predictable, recurring part of life in huge parts of the world. Monsoon regions across South and Southeast Asia, West Africa, and parts of the Americas experience rainy seasons that can last a third of the year or more. And long before waterproof roofing, drainage systems, or weather satellites, humans had to figure out how to live through it. Not just survive one storm, but survive an entire season where the ground turned to mud, rivers swelled without warning, and staying dry became a full-time occupation. The first problem was staying dry enough to stay alive. Sustained wet conditions aren't just uncomfortable, they're dangerous in a very direct, physical way. Prolonged exposure to cold, wet skin dramatically increases the risk of hypothermia, even in climates that aren't especially cold by daytime standards. A body that's constantly damp loses heat far faster than dry skin exposed to the same air temperature. This meant that for ancient humans living through a rainy season, finding or building genuinely dry shelter wasn't a comfort question. It was survival math, the same way finding food was. Early solutions were often about elevation and slope. Caves with sloped floors that channeled water away from sleeping areas were prized real estate, and archaeological evidence shows repeated, long-term use of the same shelters across generations, specifically because they solved this problem well. Where caves weren't available, people built structures raised above ground level. Early stilt houses appear independently across flood-prone river deltas and wetlands worldwide. From Southeast Asia to parts of Europe, because raising the living space even a few feet off the ground made the difference between a survivable season and a devastating one. Roofing had to solve two problems at once: shedding water and doing it without collapsing. A flat roof in a place that gets sustained heavy rain is a roof that will eventually cave in under the weight of standing water. This is one reason so many traditional building styles in high rainfall regions independently converged on steep, angled roofs. A steep pitch lets water run off quickly instead of pooling, and thick layers of overlapping thatch, palm fronds, or bark shingles created a surface that shed water in the same way feathers shed water off a duck's back, each layer overlapping the one below it, so water was guided downward and outward rather than seeping through. In parts of the world with heavy monsoon rainfall, roof overhangs were built dramatically larger than they needed to be for shade alone, extending well past the walls to keep driving rain from soaking the base of the structure and eroding the ground the building stood on. None of this required written engineering knowledge. It required generations of trial and error, and the willingness to rebuild what didn't survive the first bad season. Food storage became its own emergency during extended rain. Grain, dried meat, and other stored food are only safe from spoilage if they stay dry. A rainy season that stretched for weeks threatened not just the food people were eating that day, but everything they'd stored to get through the rest of the year. This is a big part of why elevated granaries, storage structures built on raised platforms or stilts, appear across so many agricultural societies in wet climates. Keeping stored food above ground level and under a well-built roof wasn't a minor architectural preference. It was the difference between a community eating through the following dry season or starving in it. Some cultures went further, lining storage containers with materials that repelled moisture, or building storage huts with double-layered walls that created an air gap to reduce dampness getting inside. The goal was always the same: keep the water on the outside of the food supply, no matter how long the sky refused to clear. Rivers didn't just rise, they became dangerous in ways that were hard to predict. Extended heavy rain doesn't just create local puddles. It raises river levels for miles downstream, sometimes suddenly and without any local rainfall at all, because water falling on distant mountains or highlands eventually flows down into the valleys below. Communities living near rivers in monsoon regions had to develop a working understanding of this delayed danger, noticing that a clear sky overhead didn't guarantee a safe river, because the water rushing toward them might have fallen days earlier and hundreds of miles away. This knowledge shaped where people were willing to build permanent settlements. Higher ground near a river, rather than directly on the floodplain, became the preferred location in many flood-prone regions, close enough to water for drinking, fishing, and farming, but elevated enough to avoid the worst of a seasonal flood. Settlements that ignored this balance tended not to last, and the ones that did survive passed the lesson down as unquestioned tradition, long after anyone remembered exactly why the rule existed. Rain also reshaped what people ate, because it reshaped what was available. A rainy season often meant hunting became more difficult, tracks washed away, animals sheltered rather than grazed openly, and visibility dropped. At the same time, it could mean an explosion of other food sources. Fish became easier to catch as rivers swelled and fish moved into new areas to spawn. Certain edible fungi and plants only fruit during sustained wet conditions, giving foragers who understood the seasonal pattern a reliable source of food precisely when hunting became harder. Communities that thrived through monsoon seasons weren't the ones who tried to keep hunting the same way they had in the dry season. They were the ones who shifted their entire diet to match what the rain made abundant. Fire became both harder to maintain and more essential. Wet wood doesn't burn well, and a fire that goes out during a weeks-long rainy season isn't just an inconvenience. It can mean the loss of warmth, cooking, and protection all at once. This is likely part of why so many cultures developed careful, specific knowledge about which woods burned even when damp, which bark made reliable tinder even in humid conditions, and how to build a fire pit sheltered enough from wind and drip lines that it could be kept alive through a downpour. Communities often kept a fire burning continuously for this exact reason, not from laziness about relighting it, but because relighting a fire during sustained rain without matches or lighters could be genuinely difficult or impossible. None of this was solved once and then forgotten. Living through an extended rainy season was a skill passed down and refined across generations, encoded not in manuals, but in the placement of a village, the pitch of a roof, the height of a granary floor, and the specific plants people knew to gather when the ground turned to mud. Every one of these choices represented centuries of communities that got it wrong, and communities that survived because they got it right, and slowly, painfully. Only the second group's knowledge stuck around long enough to be passed on. And in a strange way, that inheritance is still shaping your life today. The pitched roof over your head, wherever you live, has a design lineage stretching back to people solving exactly this problem, long before anyone called it architecture. The instinct to build on higher ground near water, the seasonal shift in what's available to eat, even the modern discomfort of being cold and wet. These all trace back to ancestors who lived through rain that didn't stop for weeks, and who had no choice but to figure it out. You've never had to build your own roof to survive a monsoon, but somewhere in the deep history of how humans build shelter, store food, and choose where to live, endless rain is still quietly writing the rules.